Did you know that the first American woman to fly a jet was part of a secret World War II program? Or that Walt Disney designed a mascot for these female pilots? A mascot that was a mischievous gremlin, a symbol of everything that could go wrong with an airplane. Why would they choose that, and why, after flying millions of miles for the U.S. Army, were their official records stamped classified and hidden from the public for more than 3 decades? These women were the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASPs. Over 1,100 of them flew every type of military aircraft in the American arsenal, from the smallest trainers to the heaviest bombers. They weren't fighting the enemy. They were fighting to, get the planes to the men who did. They were fighting stereotypes. They were fighting a government that wanted their service but refused to give them a uniform, a rank, or even a flag for their coffin. Their story is not just about flying. It's about a war fought on the home front, in the halls of Congress, and in the minds of a nation that wasn't sure what to do with women who could handle a B-17 bomber better than most men. What did it really cost them to serve, and why did it take a new war, decades later, for their story to finally be told? Number 15. Why were their records sealed for 33 years? It sounds like something from a spy novel. A group of pilots serves their country during a world war. They perform dangerous missions, they fly millions of miles, and when it's all over, the government takes every piece of paper related to their service, stamps it classified, and locks it away in an archive. For 33 years, it was as if they never existed. This is exactly what happened to the Women Air Force Service Pilots. The question is why? The answer is complicated. And it's not about national security. It's about politics and pride. The WASP program was shut down in December 1944. The war was not over, but the tide had turned. Male pilots were returning from overseas, and civilian male pilots who ran flight schools under government contract were afraid of losing their jobs. They lobbied Congress hard. They argued that women were taking jobs from men. They claimed women weren't physically or emotionally capable of flying military aircraft, even though the WASP's safety record was better than that of male pilots in the same training command. And a bill to officially militarize the WASP, to make them actual members of the Army Air Forces, was narrowly defeated in the House of Representatives in June 1944. The vote was 188 to 169. That defeat sealed their fate. General Henry Hap Arnold, the head of the Army Air Forces and a strong supporter of the WASPs, had no choice but to deactivate the program. When the program ended, the records were collected. Flight logs, training reports, accident reports, personnel files. Everything. These documents proved how successful the women were. They showed they flew over 60 million miles. They proved they flew every single type of aircraft the Army had. They documented the 38 women who died in service. This was a powerful story, and some people didn't want it told. The Army, perhaps embarrassed by the political battle and the program's unceremonious end, decided the easiest solution was to bury it. By classifying the records, they prevented historians, journalists, and even the women themselves from accessing the official proof of their service. It also conveniently helped the male pilots' lobby, as there was no official data to contradict their claims that the women weren't needed or weren't capable. For decades, the women lived in a strange limbo. They knew what they did, their families knew, but there was no official recognition. They were denied veterans' benefits. They couldn't get the GI Bill for education. They couldn't get VA home loans. When they told people they flew military planes in the war, some didn't believe them. The lack of official records made them invisible. It was a classic catch-22. They couldn't prove their service to get benefits because the proof was sealed. And the proof was sealed because their service was never officially military. The truth finally started to come out in the mid-1970s. The catalyst was, ironically, the U.S. Air Force. In 1976, the Air Force announced with great fanfare that it would be admitting women into its pilot training program for the first time in history. This news infuriated the former WASPs. They had flown for the military over 30 years earlier. They had been the first. The press release made it sound like they had never existed. A WASP named B. Haydu, along with many others, started a public relations campaign. They called it the Battle of the Bulge. They wrote letters. They called congressmen. A historian and son of a WASP, James E. Strickler, found a copy of the bill that had been defeated in 1944 and started pushing for a new one. It was during this fight that the sealed records became a major issue. Republican Senator Barry Goldwater, who had been a ferry pilot himself during World War II and had flown alongside the WASPs, took up their cause. He was shocked to learn their records were classified. He used his influence to get them unsealed. In 1977, the files were finally opened. The evidence was overwhelming: the flight logs, the statistics, the praise from commanding officers. It was all there. With this proof, Congress finally acted. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter signed Public Law 95-202, which granted veteran status to the WASPs. But the victory was bittersweet. It had taken 33 years, an entire generation had passed. The sealing of those records was not about protecting state secrets. It was about hiding an inconvenient truth, that women had done the job, done it well, and had been sent home without thanks when they were no longer politically convenient. What secrets might still be buried in the unreleased corners of government archives? Were there personal letters or diaries from high-ranking officials that revealed the true, unfiltered reasons for classifying the WASP records? Did the male pilots' lobby keep records of their strategies and communications? And could those documents reveal the full extent of their campaign against the women? What would a full psychological study of the surviving WASPs in the 1970s have revealed about the long-term impact of having their service officially denied for 3 decades? Number 14, who paid for their funerals? When a male soldier died serving the United States during World War II, his family knew what to expect. They would receive an official telegram that would be entitled to a government death benefit, typically around $10,000, to help with expenses. Their son's body would be escorted home by a member of his unit. The coffin would be draped in an American flag. He would receive a military funeral with honors. It was a tragic but dignified process, a nation's way of honoring the ultimate sacrifice. When a Women Airforce Service Pilot died, her family received a telegram, and that was it. 38 WASPs died while serving their country. They died in training accidents. They died on ferry missions. They died testing repaired aircraft. They died, just like their male counterparts. But their deaths were treated differently. Because they were technically civil service employees, not military personnel, they were not entitled to any military honors or benefits. The government did not pay to send their bodies home. The government did not provide a flag for their coffin. There was no military escort, no honor guard, no final salute. The family was on their own. Imagine the scene. A young woman leaves her home to fly for the army. Her family is proud but worried. Then they get the news she has been killed in a crash. In their grief, they are faced with a logistical and financial nightmare. How do they get their daughter's body from a training base in Texas back to their home in Ohio or California? The Army offered no help. The responsibility fell to the woman's family and her fellow pilots. In many cases, the other WASPs in her squadron would pool their money. They would pass a hat, each contributing a few dollars from their modest pay to cover the cost of shipping their friend's body home. Sometimes an instructor or a commanding officer would help out of his own pocket. It was an unofficial, heartbreaking ritual that underscored their strange status. They were good enough to die for their country, but not good enough for their country to bring them home. The story of Cornelia Fort is one of the most famous examples. Fort was an experienced pilot before the war. She was in the air giving a lesson over Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, and barely avoided being shot down during the attack. She became one of the first members of the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron WASP, the precursor to the WASP. On March 21st, 1943, she was flying in a formation of BT-13s from California to Texas. A male pilot's plane collided with hers. She was killed, becoming the first female pilot in American history to die on active military duty. Her death was a shock to the nation. But even for a pilot as well known as Fort, the rules were the same. There was no official military recognition. Her fellow pilots and her family handled the arrangements. This lack of benefits extended beyond death. If a WASP was injured in a crash, she had to pay her own medical bills. There was no military hospital care for them. If she survived the war, there was no GI Bill to help her go to college or start a business. There were no VA loans to help her buy a house. This reality is detailed in numerous books, including Catherine Sharp Landeck's The Women with Silver Wings. Landeck describes how the women created their own support systems, a Fifanella Fund named after their mascot, to help the families of fallen pilots. It was a grassroots effort to do what their own government would not. This was not an oversight. It was a direct consequence of their classification. General Hap Arnold and WASP Director Jacqueline Cochran fought for militarization partly for this very reason. They knew the women were in danger and deserved the same protections as men. But political opposition, as we've seen, was too strong. The women kept flying, knowing that if the worst happened, their friends would be the ones to pass the hat. How many of the 38 families had to take on significant debt to bring their daughters home and give them a proper burial? Are there any surviving records of the informal FIFANELA funds that the pilots organized, showing how much money they raised and how it was distributed? Did any of the families attempt to sue the government for wrongful death or for the cost of funeral expenses, and what happened to those legal challenges? Beyond the 38 who died, how many women suffered career-ending injuries and were left with a lifetime of medical bills that were never covered by the government they served? Number 13. Did they really fly the Widowmaker? The name alone was enough to scare pilots. The B-26 Marauder. It was a powerful, fast, medium bomber. It was also notoriously difficult to fly. It had short wings, which meant it had to land at very high speeds. Early models had a tendency to stall and crash on takeoff if one engine failed. It quickly earned a grim nickname, the Widowmaker. Many male pilots were terrified of it. They refused to fly it, so the Army Air Forces had a problem. They had a fleet of brand new effective bombers that nobody wanted. The solution came from an unlikely source, the women pilots at Avenger Field. The story goes that two experienced WASPs, Nancy Harkness Love and Jacqueline Cochran, were asked to fly the B-26 to prove it was safe. The idea was simple. If a little insulting, if a woman could fly it, then surely a man could too. It was a publicity stunt, but a dangerous one. They flew the bomber flawlessly. After their demonstration, the Army assigned a group of WASPs to ferry B-26 from the factories to the air bases. And they became the specialists in an aircraft that seasoned male combat pilots feared. They didn't just fly it once. They flew it routinely. They delivered the Widowmaker so it could be used in combat. Their success helped change the perception of the B-26 and get it into the fight. But the B-26 wasn't the only notoriously difficult plane they flew. The WASPs were tasked with flying every single aircraft in the Army's inventory. This wasn't just a matter of ferrying planes. It was about solving logistical problems. When a new plane came out of the factory, a pilot was needed to deliver it. When a plane was damaged and needed to be flown to a repair depot, a pilot was needed. When a training base needed more planes, a pilot was needed. The WASPs filled these roles, freeing up thousands of male pilots for combat duty. They flew over 75 different types of aircraft. This included nimble fighters like the P-51, Mustang, and the P-38 Lightning. It included massive cargo planes like the C-47. And it included the biggest, most complex bomber of the war, the B-29 Superfortress. The B-29 was the technological marvel of its day. It was a heavy bomber with pressurized cabins, remote-controlled gun turrets, and a massive payload. It was also notoriously difficult and dangerous, especially in its early days. The engines had a tendency to overheat and catch fire. The two WASPs, Dora Doherty and Dorothea Diddy Moorman, were selected for a special mission in 1944. Male pilots at a base in Kansas were refusing to fly the B-29 because they believed it was unsafe. The commander of the base, Colonel Paul Tibbets, who would later pilot the Enola Gay, was in a bind. He knew the women were excellent pilots. He asked Doherty and Moorman to fly the B-29 as a demonstration. The two women, with a flight engineer, put the massive bomber through its paces. They flew it in front of the male pilots, demonstrating that the plane, while demanding, was perfectly manageable. According to reports, the men's complaints stopped. The mission was a success. These stories are not just anecdotes. They are documented in the WASP official records and recounted in memoirs like A Wasp Among Eagles by Ann B. Carl. Flying these complex, often dangerous aircraft was not a side job for the WASPs, it was their primary mission. They towed targets for live-fire anti-aircraft practice, a job so dangerous that some male pilots flatly refused it. They performed engineering test flights on planes that had just been repaired, taking them up to see if the engine would hold or if the wing would stay on. Their work was not glamorous, it was gritty, dangerous, and absolutely essential to the war effort. They were not just flying planes, they were taming the most difficult beasts in the Army's stable. What were the unedited, private reactions of the male pilots who were shamed into flying the B-26 and B-29 after seeing the women fly them? Are there official reports detailing the accident rates for WASPs on these specific difficult aircraft compared to their male counterparts, and what do those numbers truly show? How many male pilots' lives were ultimately saved because the WASPs took on the most dangerous non-combat roles like target towing and experimental test flights? Were there any specific aircraft models that the WASP leadership secretly advised their pilots to be wary of, even while publicly supporting the Army's claims of their safety? Number 12. Why did Walt Disney give them a Gremlin? During World War II, Walt Disney and his studio were all in on the war effort. They produced training films, propaganda shorts, and, most visibly, over 1,200 insignia for military units. Squadrons wanted mascots, something to paint on their planes and jackets to build morale. They wanted something that represented their spirit. So, when the Women Air Force Service Pilots needed a mascot, they turned to the masters at Disney. What they got was not a soaring eagle or a fierce tiger. They got a gremlin. Her name was Fifinella. She was a small, winged female gremlin, complete with horns, a yellow flight suit, red boots, and goggles pushed up on her forehead. Gremlins were a popular piece of folklore among pilots, especially in the British Royal Air Force. They were mischievous imps who were blamed for any and all mechanical problems with an airplane. If a gauge suddenly stopped working or an engine sputtered for no reason, it was the gremlins. The idea was popularized by author Roald Dahl, who was a RAF pilot himself and wrote a book called The Gremlins. And Disney had bought the rights to the story and was developing a film. Fifinella was a character from that project. When the film was scrapped, Disney offered the design to the WASPs. On July 19, 1943, Fifinella was officially adopted as their mascot. Why would a group of pilots trying to prove their competence and professionalism adopt a mascot that represented mechanical failure? The choice was actually brilliant to show their sense of humor and their insider status in the world of aviation. By embracing the gremlin, they were acknowledging the inherent dangers and unpredictability of flying. They were saying, we know things go wrong, we've seen it all, and we're not scared. It was a wink and a nod to the shared culture of pilots everywhere. Fifinella was always depicted as getting the better of the male gremlins, or widgets, who caused the problems. She was often shown pushing them off the wings of a plane or chasing them away. So she wasn't the problem, she was the solution. She was the good gremlin who kept the bad ones at bay. The image of Fifinella was everywhere. The WASPs sewed her onto the shoulders of their flight jackets. They painted her on the noses of their aircraft. She appeared on their letterhead and at the bottom of a newsletter called the Fifinella Gazette. She became their symbol, a unique identity that set them apart. It was a female character designed by the most famous studio in the world, representing a group of pioneering women. This was no small thing in the 1940s. While other women in the war effort were represented by figures like Rosie the Riveter, a strong but earthbound factory worker, the WASPs had a symbol that was airborne, magical, and a little bit dangerous. The story of Fifinella is a small but important part of the WASP legacy. It shows they were not just a collection of individuals, but a cohesive group with a strong sense of identity and pride. They were a sisterhood, bound together by their love of flying and the challenges they faced. This is a theme explored in works like The Originals by Sarah Byrne Rickman, which details the lives of the very first women to join the Ferry Command. The mascot helped solidify that bond. Fifinella was a reminder that even in the serious business of war, there was room for wit and a shared understanding. She was their own private joke, a symbol of their mastery over the very machines that others believed they couldn't handle. Did Walt Disney personally interact with Jacqueline Cochran or any of the WASPs during the design and approval process, and what were his private thoughts on the program? Are there any surviving original sketches of Fifinella that show alternative designs or concepts that were rejected? How did the male pilots and ground crews react to seeing this female gremlin painted on military aircraft? Was it respected, ridiculed, or just ignored? After the WASP program was disbanded, what happened to all the jackets and planes bearing the Fifinella insignia? Was there a conscious effort to remove the image, or did it just fade away? Number 11. Was it a battle against the enemy or against their own countrymen? The Women Air Force Service Pilots never faced enemy fire. They never flew in combat, but they were fighting a war. Their battle was not fought in the skies over Europe or the Pacific. It was fought in the newspapers, on the radio, in the halls of Congress, and on the flight lines of their own air bases. Their opponents were not foreign soldiers, they were American male civilian pilots, skeptical congressmen, and a society that was not ready for women in the cockpit of a military plane. The most organized opposition came from a group of civilian male pilots. Before the WASP program grew, the Army had hired private flight schools to run some of its training programs. Many of these schools also had contracts to ferry aircraft. The men who ran and worked for these schools saw the WASPs as a direct threat to their livelihood. As the war progressed and the Army's own training programs produced a surplus of male pilots, these civilian instructors feared their lucrative government contracts would be cut. And they were right. The Army saw the WASPs as a cheaper, more disciplined, and readily available source of pilots for domestic missions. This fear turned into a powerful and ugly political campaign. The male pilots lobby, led by figures like the influential aviation writer Gil Rob Wilson, began a systematic effort to discredit the WASPs. They fed stories to the press. They testified before congressional committees. Their arguments were a mix of economic protectionism and outright sexism. They claimed the WASP program was an expensive and unnecessary experiment. They argued that women were not physically strong enough to handle heavy aircraft, despite all evidence to the contrary. They claimed women were emotionally unstable and would panic in an emergency. They suggested that training women was taking away resources that should be used for training male combat pilots. In a 1944 report to the House Civil Service Committee, which was investigating the proposed militarization of the WASP, these groups argued that continuing the program was a gross injustice to the thousands of male pilots available. This campaign was incredibly effective. It created a public narrative that the WASPs were a powder puff squadron, a social experiment run by the well-connected Jacqueline Cochran. This narrative ignored the dangerous, essential work the women were doing every day. It ignored their stellar safety record. It ignored the fact that they were freeing up thousands of men for combat. The pressure on Congress was immense. The newspapers ran headlines questioning the need for female pilots. The campaign culminated in the summer of 1944 when the bill to militarize the WASPs came up for a vote. The male pilots' lobby went into overdrive and the bill was defeated. Just a few months later, the program was deactivated. The men had won. They had protected their jobs by grounding the women. The story of this political fight is a central theme in many histories of the WASP, including Those Wonderful Women and Their Flying Machines by Sally Van Wageningen-Keel. It reveals a difficult truth about the home front during World War II. While the nation was united against a common enemy abroad, there were deep divisions and conflicts at home. The WASPs' battle was not just about proving they could fly, it was about fighting for their right to serve their country in the way they knew best, against men who saw their success as a threat. They flew through storms and mechanical failures, but the strongest headwinds they faced were made of prejudice and politics. What specific, underhanded tactics did the male pilots' lobby use that have not yet been fully brought to light? Were there congressmen who secretly supported the WASPs but voted against militarization due to political pressure? And did they ever express regret? How did the major newspapers and radio broadcasters of the time decide which side of the story to tell? And were they influenced by advertising dollars from the private flight schools? Did any of the WASPs ever directly confront the male lobbyists? And what happened in those personal encounters? Number 10. How did they prove a woman could handle a superfortress? The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was the most advanced, most expensive, and most feared aircraft of World War II. Not just feared by the enemy, but by the pilots who flew it. It was a monster. Its wingspan was longer than the entire length of the Wright brothers' first flight. Its 4 engines were powerful but prone to catching fire. It was the atomic bomber, the single most important weapon in the final phase of the war. And in 1944, at a base in Salina, Kansas, the male pilots being trained to fly, it were close to mutiny. They believed the plane was a death trap. The commander of this B-29 training unit was Colonel Paul Tibbets. He had a serious problem. He needed to convince his crews that the B-29 was a manageable aircraft. He needed to break the cycle of fear. So he made a radical decision. He called Jacqueline Cochran, the director of the WASP, and asked for her 2 best bomber pilots. He wanted them to come to Kansas and fly the B-29. His logic was simple and brutal. If these men see a woman fly this plane with ease, they will be too embarrassed to complain anymore. The 2 women chosen for this mission were Dora Dougherty and Dorothea Diddy Moorman. Both were highly experienced pilots who had already demonstrated exceptional skill flying other heavy bombers like the B-17. When they arrived in Kansas, they were given the B-29 flight manual and told to study it. For 3 days, they memorized every procedure, every emergency checklist, every system in the incredibly complex aircraft. Then, with a male flight engineer, they took the B-29 up for a flight. They flew it for several hours, practicing takeoffs, landings, and various maneuvers. They found the plane to be demanding but responsive. It was heavy on the controls, but its performance was incredible. The next day was the demonstration. Colonel Tibbets assembled his reluctant male pilots. They watched as Doherty and Moorman taxied the massive silver bomber onto the runway. They watched as it took off smoothly. For the next hour, the two women put the B-29 through its paces. They flew it low over the field. They demonstrated single-engine performance. They made it look easy. When they landed, a crowd of stunned men was waiting for them. According to reports from the event, the atmosphere on the base changed almost overnight. The complaints and whispers stopped. The men got back to their training. The mission, detailed in an official Army Air Forces report from September 1944 titled Special Project for AAF Training Command, was a complete success. This was not just a stunt, it was a calculated psychological operation. It was also a testament to the skill of the WASPs. Doherty and Moorman were not just symbols, they were expert pilots who could master the most complex aircraft in the world after just a few days of study. Their flight had a direct impact on the war effort, helping to get B-29 crews trained and deployed to the Pacific. But the story also reveals the deep-seated skepticism they faced. Their skills were used not just to fly missions, but to manage the male ego. They were asked to do something that no man had been asked to do, to use their gender as a tool to prove a point. And they succeeded, but their success was, in a way, used against them. The story of the girls who tamed the superfortress was not widely publicized at the time. It was an internal Army matter, another piece of the WASP legacy that remained hidden for years. Were there any sabotage attempts or subtle forms of resistance from male ground crews or pilots at the Kansas base before or during the demonstration flight? What were the private, uncensored conversations between Doherty and Moorman after they completed the flight? Or did they feel proud, used, or a combination of both? Did Colonel Tibbets write any personal letters or memos about the event that reveal more about his motivations in the immediate aftermath? What long-term impact did this demonstration have on the careers of the male pilots who witnessed it? Did any of them ever publicly acknowledge the role the women played in changing their perspective? Number 9. What was it like to be a human target? Of all the dangerous jobs the Women Airforce Service Pilots performed, one stood out as uniquely terrifying. It was called target towing. The job was simple in theory and harrowing in practice. A WASP would fly a sturdy, reliable aircraft, usually an older model like a B-26 or a Douglas A-24. Trailing hundreds of feet behind the plane on a long steel cable was a large canvas sleeve, the target. On the ground, male soldiers and anti-aircraft artillery units would be waiting. Their job was to learn how to shoot down enemy planes by practicing on this moving target. The WASP's job was to fly straight and level, back and forth over these gun emplacements, while hundreds of men shot at the target with live ammunition. This was not a simulation. The bullets were real, the shells were real, and the gunners were students. They were inexperienced, their aim was not always perfect, the women flew in what was essentially a live fire zone. The canvas targets were frequently riddled with holes, which was the point, but sometimes the planes themselves were hit. WASP pilot Mabel Rawlinson was killed during a target towing mission in 1943. Her plane crashed, and the exact cause was never definitively determined, but it happened during this incredibly dangerous duty. The women knew the risks every time they took off. They could hear the shells exploding around them, and they could see the tracer rounds zipping past their cockpit. Why were women assigned this incredibly hazardous job? Part of the reason was a grim practicality. The Army needed to train its anti-aircraft gunners, and this was the only way to do it realistically. Male pilots were in high demand for combat, and many considered target towing a dead-end, punishing assignment. Some even refused the duty. The WASPs, on the other hand, never refused a mission. They were determined to prove their worth and their courage. If the Army needed pilots to be human targets, they would do it. Their willingness to take on these undesirable and dangerous jobs is a recurring theme in their history. According to the records at the National WASP WWII Museum, target towing was one of the most vital services the women provided, directly contributing to the effectiveness of air defense units. The experience of being a target was surreal. The pilots were often accompanied by a radio operator in the back of the plane. The operator's job was to unspool the target cable and, crucially, to report to the ground crews on the accuracy of their shots. A little to the left, you're high. They were acting as flying instructors for the men shooting at them. The women developed strategies to stay safe. They learned the rhythms of the guns. They knew that when one battery stopped firing to reload, it was a good time to make their turn. They placed bets on who could get their target sleeve the most shot up without getting their plane hit. They used humor to cope with the fear. But the fear was always there, Every flight was a gamble. It was a strange inverted kind of combat where their mission was to fly predictably and draw fire, not to evade it. They were the bait, and their survival depended on the skill, or lack thereof, of the men on the ground. What was the actual statistical rate of aircraft being hit by friendly fire during these target towing missions, and how did it compare to other flight operations? Are there any surviving transcripts of the radio communications between the WASP pilots and the ground-based gunnery crews during a live fire exercise? What did they talk about? Did the male gunnery students know their targets were being flown by women? And if so, did it affect their performance or attitude? How many WASPs suffered from what we would now call PTSD as a result of the constant stress of being shot at? And was this ever acknowledged or treated at the time? Number 8, who was the real boss, a cosmetics queen or a society girl? The story of the Women Airforce Service Pilots is inseparable from the story of two powerful, ambitious, and very different women, Jacqueline Cochran and Nancy Harkness Love. They were the leaders of the two programs that eventually merged to become the WASP. They shared a common goal to get women flying for the military, but their methods, their backgrounds, and their visions were worlds apart. Their rivalry shaped the entire program, creating a tension that simmered just beneath the surface. Jacqueline Cochran was a force of nature. She grew up in poverty in the sawdust mills of Florida, a self-made woman who clawed her way to the top. She became a famous air racer, setting numerous speed and altitude records. She was a friend of Amelia Earhart. At the same time, she built a successful cosmetics empire, Jacqueline Cochran Cosmetics. She was glamorous, tough, and incredibly well-connected politically. She was a close friend of Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt. Her vision for women pilots was grand and centralized. She wanted a large single organization to train women from scratch, turning them into military-style pilots under her direct command. She believed that women needed to be trained by the Army, to the Army's standards, to be truly accepted. Nancy Harkness Love, on the other hand, was the opposite. She was born into a wealthy and prominent Boston family. She was a society girl who went to the best schools. She learned to fly at a young age and was an exceptionally skilled pilot by the time the war began. She was quiet, reserved, and respected for her flying ability, not her political maneuvering. Her vision was more practical and immediate. She believed there were already dozens of highly experienced female pilots in the country who could go to work right away. She didn't see the need for a massive training program. She proposed creating a small, elite corps of experienced women to ferry planes for the Air Transport Command. Her approach was to find the best and put them to work immediately, integrating them into the existing military structure. Initially, both women's proposals were met with resistance, but as the need for pilots grew after Pearl Harbor, the Army decided to try both ideas. In September 1942, Nancy Harkness Love's group was formed first. It was called the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, or WAFs. They were an elite group. The first 25 members each had over 1,000 hours of flight time. They were immediately successful. At the same time, Jacqueline Cochran used her political influence with General Hap Arnold to create a separate program, the Women's Flying Training Detachment WFTD, based in Houston and later Sweetwater, Texas. This was her vision, a large-scale school to train female pilots. For nearly a year, these two separate and distinct programs operated. The WAFs were the experienced ferry pilots, the WFTD were the trainees, but it was an inefficient system, and the rivalry between Cochran and Love was causing friction. In August 1943, General Arnold made a decision. He merged the two organizations into a single entity, the Women Airforce Service Pilots. And he put Jacqueline Cochran in charge as the director of women pilots. Nancy Harkness Love was made the executive in charge of WASP ferry operations under the Air Transport Command, a subordinate role. Cochran had won the power struggle. Her centralized training model became the standard, and every WASP, including the original experienced WAFs, was now part of her organization. The clash of these two personalities is a key part of the WASP story, as told in books like Susan Welsey's Yankee Doodle Gals. It was a battle between two different philosophies, Love's quiet competence versus Cochran's political prowess. In the end, politics won. What private conversations or deals occurred between Jacqueline Cochran and General Hap Arnold that led to her being chosen over Nancy Harkness Love to lead the combined WASP. Are there any surviving letters or diary entries from the original WASP pilots that express their true feelings about being absorbed into Cochran's organization and losing their elite status? How did the day-to-day operational relationship between Cochran and Love function after the merger? Was it professional or was it filled with conflict? If Nancy Harkness Love had been put in charge instead, how would the WASP program have been different in terms of its size, mission, and ultimate legacy? Number 7, did you have to be a certain race to fly? The Women Air Force Service Pilots program is rightly celebrated as a story of breaking gender barriers. It proved that women could fly military aircraft just as well as men, but while it was breaking one barrier, it was upholding another, more pervasive one, the color barrier. The WASP program was a reflection of the segregated America of the 1940s. While it opened the cockpit to women, it kept it firmly closed to African American women. Throughout the war, qualified and experienced black female pilots applied to the program. The most well-known was Mildred Hemmons Carter, a graduate of the Tuskegee Institute's pilot training program. She was an excellent pilot with all the necessary qualifications. Her application was rejected. The official reason given was usually a technicality, but the unofficial reason was clear. Jacqueline Cochran, the director of the WASP, made the decision not to accept black applicants. In an interview years later, she claimed that integrating the program would have created too much controversy and could have jeopardized the entire experiment. She argued that she was trying to fight one battle at a time, the battle of gender, and that fighting the battle of race at the same time was a political impossibility. This was the same pragmatic argument used to justify segregation throughout the military and American society. However, the story of race in the WASP is not entirely black and white. While African American women were excluded, a very small number of women of color did manage to get in. 2 Native American women, Ola Mildred Millie Rexroth and Oglala Sioux from South Dakota, and Bernice B. Falke-Du of Chippewa heritage, served as WASPs. And most notably, Hazel Ying Lee, a Chinese American woman from Portland, Oregon, became one of the program's most skilled pilots. Lee was already an experienced pilot before the war. She was rejected by the Chinese Air Force because she was a woman, so she joined the WASP. She was known for her skill, her sense of humor, and her fearlessness. She specialized in flying fighter planes, the fast and powerful P-51s and P-63s. Tragically, Hazel Ying Lee was killed in November 1944, just a month before the program was deactivated. She was trying to land a P-63 at a base in Montana when another plane collided with hers. She was the last WASP to die in service. In her story and the stories of the other women of color in the program are an important but often overlooked part of the WASP legacy. They show that the program was not entirely monolithic, but they also highlight the stark reality of the era's racial hierarchy. The inclusion of a few women from certain minority groups was deemed acceptable, while the inclusion of African Americans was not. This reality is documented in works like The Forgotten Heroines by Sarah Byrne Rickman, which specifically explores the experiences of the women of color who flew as WASPs. The program that fought so hard against one form of prejudice was ultimately a product of another. Were there any internal memos or discussions within the Army Air Force's command about the policy of excluding black women, and did anyone at a high level argue against it? How did the other WASPs treat Hazel Ying Lee and the Native American pilots? Were they fully accepted into the sisterhood, or did they face subtle prejudice within the ranks? What happened to the other qualified black female pilots like Mildred Carter after they were rejected? Did they find other ways to contribute to the war effort as aviators? Did Jacqueline Cochran ever express personal regret for her decision, or did she maintain it was a necessary political compromise until her death? Number 6, how much did it cost to serve your country? Joining the military is typically not a path to wealth, but it usually doesn't cost you money. The government provides uniforms, housing, food, and training. For the Women Air Force Service Pilots, the financial arrangement was completely different. They were civilian volunteers and they had to pay their own way. This financial burden was a significant and often overlooked hardship of their service. It was a constant reminder of their unofficial status. The costs started before they even arrived for training. Applicants had to travel to one of several interview locations across the country entirely at their own expense. If they were accepted, they had to pay for their own transportation to the training base at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. For a woman from Maine or California, this was a significant cost in 1943, and it was just the beginning. Once they arrived, the financial obligations continued. They were required to purchase their own uniforms. These were not standard issue Army uniforms. They were specially designed by the high-end department store, Neiman Marcus. The official uniform, a winter flying suit in Santiago blue, was stylish but expensive. The women also had to pay for their dress uniforms, shoes, and other required clothing. The financial drain didn't stop with clothing. During their rigorous 7-month training, the WASPs had to pay for their own room and board. The Army deducted these costs directly from their monthly pay of $150. After deductions, a trainee might be left with very little cash for personal expenses. This was a stark contrast to male aviation cadets who received free room and board, free uniforms, and a higher monthly stipend. The women also had to buy their own textbooks and flight equipment, and then there was life insurance. Because they were civilians engaged in hazardous flying, it was almost impossible for them to get a life insurance policy. For the few who could find a company willing to insure them, the premiums were astronomical. This financial precarity was a constant source of stress. The women were flying dangerous missions, but if they were killed, their families would receive no government benefits. This is why, as mentioned earlier, the pilots often pooled their own money to help the family of a fallen sister. It was a self-funded support system born of government neglect. This financial aspect of their service is detailed in numerous personal memoirs from the pilots, who often joked about being the best-dressed, worst-paid pilots in the Army. The reality behind the joke was a serious inequity. They were providing an essential service, taking on immense risk, and essentially subsidizing the U.S. government for the privilege of doing so. Were there any official cost-benefit analyses conducted by the Army that calculated how much money they were saving by classifying the WASPs as civilians instead of military personnel? How did the women from lower income backgrounds manage these costs? Are there records of women having to drop out of the program, not because they failed flight training, but because they simply ran out of money? Did any companies like Neiman Marcus offer the women discounts or payment plans for their mandatory uniforms, or was it strictly business? So what was the total estimated out-of-pocket cost for an individual woman to complete the WASP program from application to graduation? Number 5, what happened to the first woman to fly a jet? The jet age began in the final years of World War II. These new, incredibly fast aircraft were top secret, the cutting edge of military technology. The pilots chosen to test them were considered the best of the best. In 1944, at Wright Field in Ohio, the center of Army aviation research, a small group of pilots was being introduced to America's first jet-powered aircraft, the Bell P-59 Aerocomet. Among these elite test pilots was a woman. Her name was Anne Baumgartner. Baumgartner was a WASP, but she wasn't a ferry pilot. She was stationed at the Flight Test Division at Wright Field, a highly coveted assignment. Her job was to fly experimental aircraft, and she tested planes that had been modified with new engines or control systems. It was incredibly dangerous work. One of her fellow WASP test pilots at Wright Field, Jane DeDecker, was killed when the plane she was testing crashed. Baumgartner, however, excelled. She was a precise, analytical pilot, perfect for the demanding world of flight testing. Because of her skill, she was chosen for the jet program. On October 14, 1944, Anne Baumgartner climbed into the cockpit of the P-59. She went through the startup sequence, a new and unfamiliar process for a plane without a propeller. She taxied to the runway and took off. In that moment, she became the first American woman to fly a jet aircraft. The flight was a success. She found the jet to be smooth and quiet compared to the loud, vibrating propeller planes she was used to. It was, as she later described it, like a Buck Rogers experience. She was flying the future. Her historic flight, however, was not celebrated with public fanfare. The jet program was highly classified. Her achievement remained a secret, known only to a small circle of people at Wright Field. Just 2 months later, in December 1944, the WASP program was disbanded, and Baumgartner, along with all the other women, was sent home. Her career as a military test pilot was over. The woman who had been at the forefront of aviation technology was suddenly a civilian again, with no official veteran status and no path to continue her work. After the war, she married another pilot and raised a family. She continued to fly recreationally, but her professional career in aviation was cut short. Like many WASPs, her extraordinary wartime service became a kind of secret history, a story she told her family but that the world did not know. It wasn't until the records were unsealed in the 1970s that her achievement and the achievements of all the WASPs began to receive public recognition. Her story, detailed in various aviation histories and in her own words in interviews before her death in 2008, is a perfect microcosm of the WASP experience, a moment of incredible achievement and groundbreaking performance, followed by a sudden and unceremonious dismissal, with the full story hidden from view for decades. What was the reaction of the male test pilots at Wright Field to Anne Baumgartner's selection for the jet program? Was there resentment, support, or professional indifference? Are there any declassified flight test reports from her P-59 flights that contain her personal notes and observations about the aircraft's performance? Did any other WASPs come close to being selected for the jet program, and what were the criteria for that selection? If the WASP program had not been disbanded, what is the likelihood that Baumgartner would have gone on to become a test pilot for the next generation of jet fighters, like the F-80 or F-86? Number 4. Why were they sent home before the war was over? On December 20th, 1944, the last class of Women Airforce Service Pilots graduated from their training at Avenger Field. It was supposed to be a day of celebration. Instead, it was a funeral. General Hap Arnold, the head of the Army Air Forces, flew down to Sweetwater, Texas to address the women. He told them how valuable their service had been. He praised their skill and their patriotism, and he told them that the program was being deactivated effective immediately. The war was far from over. The Battle of the Bulge was raging in Europe, but the WASPs were being sent home. The deactivation was a brutal and demoralizing process. The women were not given an honorable discharge because they were never officially in the military. They were simply terminated from their civil service contracts. They were given no ceremony, no medals, no thanks from the government. They were instructed to leave the bases where they had served. The Army would not even pay for their trip home. The women had to buy their own train tickets. The final act of their service was reaching into their own pockets to pay to leave. Many of the pilots have described this as one of the most painful moments of their lives. They felt used and discarded. The official reason for the deactivation was that the war situation had changed. The Army now had a surplus of male pilots. The massive training programs in the U.S. had produced more pilots than were needed for combat roles. Male civilian pilots who had been instructors were now looking for work. The political pressure from these groups who saw the WASPs as competition reached a boiling point in the summer of 1944 when the militarization bill failed. Once that bill was defeated, the program's days were numbered. It was no longer politically sustainable to keep a group of civilian women flying military planes when male pilots were available. The decision was a political one, not a military one. The WASPs were performing their duties exceptionally well. They had a better safety record than their male counterparts in the training command. They were reliable and professional. As Catherine Sharp Landeck points out in The Women with Silver Wings, the commanding officers of the bases where WASPs served almost universally praised their performance and protested the deactivation. They knew how valuable the women were, but the decision was made in Washington, far from the flight lines. The women were a political liability. The program was shut down to appease the powerful male pilots' lobby and to solve a public relations problem. The day the program ended, a final, unofficial ceremony took place at Avenger Field. The women gathered. They sang their songs, they said their goodbyes, the flag was lowered, and then they scattered, heading back to their civilian lives. Like there was no parade, there were no headlines. One of the most successful and groundbreaking military experiments of the war ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, bitter dismissal. The women who had flown 60 million miles for their country were sent packing. What was the immediate operational impact on the Air Transport Command and other units after the WASPs were suddenly removed from service? Did flight schedules slip? Were there logistical problems? Are there any private letters or diary entries from General Hap Arnold that reveal his true feelings about having to shut down a program he had championed? What happened to the aircraft facilities and records at Avenger Field in the days and weeks immediately following the deactivation? How many of the male civilian pilots who had lobbied against the WASPs were actually hired by the Army to fill the roles the women had vacated? Number 3 was training harder than combat. Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, was not a glamorous place. It was hot, dusty, and flat. The wind never stopped blowing. The nearby town was small and offered few distractions. For the young women who came here to become pilots, it was a world of military discipline, intense academic pressure, and grueling flight instruction. The training program for the Women Airforce Service Pilots was designed to be identical to the one for male Army Air Forces cadets. It was brutally difficult and the washout rate was high. Nearly half of the women who started the program did not finish. The training lasted for 7 months. The women were divided into classes, just like a military academy. Their days were rigidly structured. They started before dawn with physical training, then came a full day of classes and flying. In the classroom, they studied meteorology, navigation, physics, aircraft mechanics, and military law. They had to learn everything a male cadet had to learn. They were tested constantly. In the air, they started with primary trainers like the PT-17 Stearman, an open cockpit biplane. They had to master basic maneuvers, takeoffs, landings, and emergency procedures. Their instructors were a mix of civilian and military pilots, many of whom were initially skeptical of teaching women to fly. After mastering the primary trainers, they moved on to basic trainers like the BT-13, a much more powerful and complex aircraft. This is where many trainees washed out. The Multivibrator, as it was nicknamed, was demanding and unforgiving. Finally, they graduated to advanced trainers like the AT-6 Texan, the same plane used to prepare male pilots for flying fighters. They also trained on twin-engine aircraft like the AT-17. They learned to fly by instruments, in formation, and at night. It was a comprehensive and exhausting curriculum. As documented in WASP memoirs, the pressure was immense. The women knew they were part of an experiment. They knew that any failure would be used as evidence that women weren't capable. So they pushed themselves, studied late into the night, and supported each other. A strong sense of sisterhood developed in the barracks. Life at Avenger Field was not just about work. The women found ways to have fun. They put on plays and musical shows. They had dances, they developed their own traditions and slang, but the underlying reality was one of constant evaluation. A bad check ride, a failed exam, or an accumulation of demerits for minor rule infractions could get a woman sent home. 38 women died during the war, and many of those deaths occurred during training. Mid-air collisions, mechanical failures, and pilot error were constant dangers. The training was designed to weed out anyone who was not in the top tier. For the women who made it through, graduation was a moment of immense pride. They had survived one of the most demanding pilot training programs in the world. They had proven they had what it took. What was the single most common reason for a woman washing out of the training program? Was it a specific flight maneuver, a particular academic subject, or something else? Are there any surviving records from the instructors that contain their candid, private assessments of the female trainees compared to the male cadets they had taught? How did the social dynamics and power structures within the small town of Sweetwater, Texas, change as a result of this massive influx of ambitious, independent young women? Beyond the official records, what were the unwritten rules and social codes that governed life for the women in the barracks at Avenger Field? Number 2, how long did it take to be called a veteran? The Women Airforce Service Pilots program ended on December 20th, 1944. On that day, the women lost their jobs, their connection to the military, and their dream of becoming official members of the Army Air Forces. But their fight for recognition was just beginning. It would take 33 years, a new generation of female pilots, and a battle in the halls of Congress before they were finally officially called veterans. After the war, the WASPs scattered back to their civilian lives. They were proud of what they had done, but they had no official proof. They were denied access to the benefits that their male counterparts received. The most significant of these was the GI Bill of 1944, a transformative piece of legislation that provided veterans with money for college, vocational training, and low-interest loans to buy homes and start businesses. The GI Bill helped build the American middle class in the post-war years. The WASPs were excluded from it. They had worn a uniform, served under military command, and flown military planes, but because of a bureaucratic classification, they were not entitled to the same rewards. For decades, they lived in this frustrating limbo. They formed their own organizations to stay connected and preserve their history. But in the eyes of the government, they were just civilian employees. The turning point came in the 1970s. As the U.S. military began to open up more roles to women, the Air Force proudly announced that in 1976, it would be accepting women into its pilot training program for the first time. This public erasure of their history was the final straw for many of the WSPs. They decided it was time to fight back. Led by women like B. Haidu and supported by the son of a WASP, Bruce Arnold General, Hap Arnold's son, they launched a coordinated campaign. They gave interviews, wrote letters to the editor, and lobbied their representatives in Washington. They called their effort the Battle of the Bulge, a nod to the war they had served in. Their goal was simple: to get a bill through Congress that would grant them the military status and veterans benefits they had been denied for so long. Their most powerful ally was Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. Goldwater had been a ferry pilot with the Air Transport Command during the war. He had flown with the WASPs. He knew firsthand how skilled they were and how critical their service had been. He was outraged to learn they had been denied recognition. He championed their cause in the Senate. The fight was not easy. There was opposition from the Veterans Administration and some traditional veterans groups who were concerned about setting a precedent for other civilian groups who had served in the war. But the WASPs and their supporters were relentless. They presented the evidence from their recently unsealed records, the 60 million miles flown, the 38 lives lost, the praise from their commanding officers. The case was overwhelming. In 1977, both the House and the Senate passed the bill. On November 23, 1977, President Jimmy Carter signed Public Law 95-202 into law. It retroactively granted the women of the WASP full military veteran status. After 33 years of being invisible, they were finally recognized. It was a monumental victory, but it was long overdue. For many of the women, it came too late in their lives to take full advantage of the educational or housing benefits. But it was about more than money. It was about honor. It was about having their country finally say, "Thank you," with specific members of Congress or officials in the Veterans Administration were the most vocal opponents of granting the WASPs veteran status in the 1970s. And what were their stated reasons? Are there any records of the private negotiations and compromises that happened behind the scenes to get the bill passed? How many WASPs were still alive in 1977 to see this victory, and what was the immediate, tangible impact on their lives? Did this law actually open the floodgates for other civilian groups to claim veteran status, as the opponents feared, or was that an unfounded concern? Number 1, why was the cemetery gate the final battlefield? For the Women Airforce Service Pilots, the fight for recognition did not end in 1977 when they were granted veteran status. It continued for decades. The final, and perhaps most symbolic, battle was fought over a small plot of land in Arlington National Cemetery. It was a fight for the right to be buried alongside the men they had served with, a right they had earned but once again had to fight for. Being eligible for burial at Arlington National Cemetery is one of the highest honors for an American veteran. With their veteran status secured in 1977, it was assumed that the WASPs were eligible, and for years they were. Several WASPs were laid to rest at Arlington, their service finally given the nation's ultimate honor. But in 2015, that right was suddenly taken away. The Secretary of the Army at the time, John McHugh, ruled that the WASPs and other World War II-era active duty designees were not eligible for interment at Arlington. The reasoning was bureaucratic and legalistic. The Army argued that the 1977 law gave them veteran status for the purpose of benefits from the VA, but it did not specifically make them eligible for burial at Arlington, which the Army manages under its own set of rules. The decision was a devastating blow to the remaining WASPs, most of whom were now in their 90s. One of them was Elaine Harmon. She had served as a WASP, flying B-17s and other aircraft. After she died in 2015, her final wish was to have her ashes placed at Arlington. Her family was informed that this was no longer possible. The gate to the nation's most sacred shrine had been closed to her and her sisters in arms. What followed was the final battle for the WASPs, a fight waged not by them, but for them, by their children and grandchildren. Elaine Harmon's family, along with other supporters, launched a massive public campaign. They started a petition on change.org that gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures. They used social media to spread the story. The hashtag Honor Elaine became a rallying cry. They contacted lawmakers and gave interviews to the press. The story was compelling and infuriating. 90-year-old female veterans of World War II were being denied their final resting place due to a technicality. The public outcry was immense. The cause was taken up by members of Congress from both parties. Representative Martha McSally of Arizona, a retired Air Force fighter pilot, introduced a bill to restore the WASP's eligibility. She argued forcefully that it was a disgrace to deny these women the honor they had earned. The campaign put the Army in an impossible position. They were on the wrong side of history, public opinion, and basic fairness. In 2016, the bill passed both the House and the Senate with unanimous support. On May 20th, 2016, President Barack Obama signed the law, officially ensuring that the Women Airforce Service Pilots were eligible for burial at Arlington National Cemetery. In September of that year, Elaine Harmon's ashes were finally laid to rest at Arlington with full military honors. It was the culmination of a fight that had lasted over 70 years. From the day they first reported for duty, the WASPs had to fight for everything: for the right to fly, for the right to be in the military, for the right to be called veterans, and finally, for the right to be buried among their nation's heroes. Their struggle at the gates of Arlington was a final poignant reminder that their service was a constant battle, not just in the skies, but for their very place in history. Who exactly was responsible for the 2015 Army legal interpretation that reversed the long-standing policy of allowing WASPs to be buried at Arlington, and was there any political motivation behind it? Are there any other groups of veterans or service members who are currently in a similar state of bureaucratic limbo regarding their burial rights? What would have happened if the public campaign and congressional action had failed? Would the families have pursued a lawsuit against the Department of Defense? Now that this final honor is secured, what is the next frontier for ensuring the WASP legacy is fully and accurately remembered, and what parts of their story still remain untold?